Welcome everybody. You got me here today, having just given myself a DIY lockdown haircut, to read chapter 16, which is called Amos and the Affluent Society. So far, the stories of the prophets have been told in the Bible as part of the record of the kings. Samuel and Nathan appeared as characters in the stories of Saul and David. Elijah and Micaiah featured in the account of the reign of Ahab and Jezebel. They've all been remembered more for what they did than for what they said, for their courage, for their defence of the rights of ordinary citizens against despotic monarchs, and for their influence on the political and religious developments of their day. In the case of Elijah, and even more so of his successor Elisha, legends grew up around them, as they always do around men of outstanding calibre, especially when their stories are passed on verbally and not written up until long after they're dead, sometimes centuries later. When we read, for example, that Elijah had a magic cloak with which he could divide the waters of the River Jordan, or that at his death he was carried into the skies in a chariot of fire, this isn't history but folklore. But it does show that Elijah was regarded as something more than a mortal. Or when Elisha miraculously recovered an iron axe head which had fallen into the Jordan, in order to save the skin of the poor man who had had it on loan, we can recognise the type of story that followers of holy men in all religions have delighted in inventing. Yet the same Elisha undoubtedly played a very big part in public affairs as well. But although all these earlier prophets fought valiantly to maintain the difference between the people of Yahweh and all other nations, reminding kings and commoners alike that the kind of behaviour that was good enough elsewhere was not good enough in Israel, nevertheless, their understanding was limited by the times they lived in. Elijah risked his life to oust Jezebel's god and root out all that he stood for from the life of Israel. But it doesn't seem to have worried either him or Elisha that the state religion of Yahweh in their day was little different in practice from that of the old Canaanite gods. They fought to make Yahweh the only God in Israel, but they didn't question the existence of other gods in other nations, nor did they seem to realise that what went on in the temples and shrines of Israel would have made Moses turn in his grave. It was not until 100 years later, in the middle of the 8th century BC, that the first of the great prophets, Amos, heralded a breakthrough in the understanding of the nature of God and the kind of service he demands. It was due to Amos and the other major spokesmen of Yahweh who followed him that the faith and moral standards which Moses had established in outline were fashioned into the imperishable legacy which the people of the Old Testament handed on to Christianity. Again, we must be careful not to claim too much. The great prophets were children of their time, as we all are, with limited insights and restricted knowledge. But we have in the Bible their own words, collected by their disciples in the books that bear their name, a testimony to their profound assessment of the meaning and purpose of life and of the kind of God who controls the universe. Unlike their predecessors, their outstanding contribution came from what they said rather than from what they did. They were no less courageous, no less ready to intervene in public affairs, no less men of action, but they're altogether more comprehensible. They're no longer rather bizarre figures from an unfamiliar ancient past, but men who grapple with problems that are as real today as they were then. Their background is certainly still that of the world as it was 8 centuries before Christ, but their message has a relevance that is timeless. When Amos came on the scene, about 750 BC, the two little kingdoms of Israel and Judah were basking in a deceptive Indian summer of prosperity and peace. Israel was only 30 years from her downfall. But for the time being, the great world powers were too busy trying to exterminate each other to bother about the small fry in the Levant. So Israel had taken the opportunity to extend her frontiers at the expense of her neighbours, and was now sitting back to enjoy the reward of her efforts. Wealth was pouring into the country from the plunder of conquest. Trade and commerce were enjoying an illusory boom. The picture we get from Amos himself is one of unbridled luxury and extravagance. It looked as if the affluent society had come to stay. It was not just the court, as in Solomon's day, that profited from the flow of easy money. A new class of merchant prince had arisen, who had quickly learned to cultivate expensive tastes. Costly palaces, rich furnishings, lavish tables, rare delicacy, choice vintages, gorgeous robes, expensive jewellery. Here is Amos's caustic description. You who lie on beds of ivory and sprawl upon your couches, eating choice lambs and farm-fed veal, who croon to the music of the harp and compose melodies as though you were David himself. You who drink wine by the bowlful and anoint yourselves with the finest oils. But it was no affluent society for the great mass of the people. Little or nothing of Israel's prosperity came their way. Poverty and starvation sat at the palace gates. Peasant farmers found themselves evicted by absentee landlords or condemned to work as slaves on their own farms in order to pay their debts. This concentration of the wealth in the hands of a few men was bad enough. But in addition, the merchants cheated and judges could be bribed. Dishonesty and perjury walked hand in hand with squalor. Amos, in biting words, condemns the acquisitive society that Israel had become. Listen to this, you who trample on the needy and grind the faces of the poor. You who say, when will the festival of the new moon be past, so that we may sell our grain? When will the Sabbath be over, so that we may offer our corn for sale? While you make your measure short and your prices high, and cheat with biased scales, and all to possess the poor for silver, and the needy for the price of a pair of shoes, selling for grain the sweepings from your floor. For I know how wilful are your crimes, and how determined are your sins. You browbeat honest men, you take bribes, and ignore the poor man's claim for justice. Therefore a wise man keeps his mouth shut, for the days are full of menace. On the other hand, the state religion was, like the national economy, on the crest of the wave. Places of worship were crowded out. The holy festivals were observed with enthusiasm. People were falling over each other to demonstrate their zeal for God. The tithes were paid punctiliously, and freewill offerings were made with a maximum of publicity. No one seemed to be asking what all this religiosity added up to, or what kind of God was being honoured. Still less did they seem to worry that the austere God of the Ten Commandments, whose servants they were supposed to be, might not approve of the pagan practices which they'd incorporated into the state religion of Yahweh, where lust, dishonesty and drunkenness flourished under the very roof of the house of God. Amos chapter 2. Father and son use the same temple girl, and so defile my holy name. Beside every altar they lounge on garments which they took on pledge, and in the houses of their gods they drink away the money they imposed in fines. This was the situation. Social inequality, flagrant injustice, and corruption of religion, which Amos denounced. He was a blunt shepherd from the hills, who disclaimed any connection with the well-paid official prophets of the state religion. But what he'd seen in the market towns and at the annual fairs cried out for protest from a man who still believed in the God of Moses. Amos made no secret of his passionate hatred of this travesty of what was expected from the people whom Yahweh had chosen. He proclaimed his protest in season and out of season, in the marketplace and in the temple, unsparingly, without mincing his words. He lashed with his tongue the that surrounded Israel for their crimes of inhumanity. But even more, he accused Israel itself of its failure to be the people of God. Because they'd been set apart at the Exodus and marvellously guided through their long story, this didn't mean that they could do as they liked and trust in God to protect them. Their responsibility was greater, not less, and they would feel the weight of God's judgment and punishment like all the rest. They need not rely on their religiosity to save them. This was not the kind of service that God demanded. Amos pronounced God's verdict on the religion of his time. I loathe and despise your festivals. Your meetings for sacrifice give me no pleasure. You may bring me your burnt offerings, your meal offerings, or your thank offerings of fat cattle, and I shall not so much as look on them. Let me have no more of your noisy hymns. My ears are closed to the music of your harps. Instead, let justice roll on like a mighty river, and integrity flow like a never-failing stream. Justice in the community, integrity in the individual, sincerity in religion, these, according to Amos, were the marks of the people of God. Responsibility, not privilege, was the meaning of Israel's calling. Amos's powerful message was too unpalatable for the authorities, and he was banished to his farm in the hills. The disaster that he predicted, which he saw as the judgment of God on a corrupt society, came 30 years later, when Israel's leaders were taken into captivity by the Assyrians and the country was laid waste.